All right, let's talk about something that feels like it's everywhere: global inequality. It's a topic that's just full of passionate debates, headlines that seem to contradict each other, and facts that just don't seem to add up. Today, we're going to try and cut through some of that noise.
So here's the big question, right? Is the gap between the world's rich and poor actually getting smaller, or is it getting bigger? You'll hear one expert on TV say, we're making incredible progress, and then the next one will say the world's never been more divided. So who's actually right?
Well, the wild and kind of confusing answer is yes, they're both right. Global inequality is getting better, and it's getting worse at the exact same time. And to really get your head around how that's even possible, you need to understand that there are two completely different stories of inequality being told.
And this is what you could call the Great Inequality Paradox. It sounds impossible for sure, but it is absolutely central to understanding the true state of our world today.
Okay, so let's really dive into this. To solve this paradox, the first thing we have to do is understand that economists are using two very different lenses to look at the exact same world. It all, and I mean all, comes down to how you measure the gap. The first lens is what we call relative inequality. Now, this is all about ratios and percentages. It's asking, are the poorest countries growing faster than the richest countries? Are they closing the gap in terms of their growth rate? You can think of it like a race, where we're not just looking at who's ahead, but who's speeding up the most.
And then there's the second lens, absolute inequality. This one is so much more straightforward. It completely ignores percentages and just looks at the cold, hard cash difference. It asks a really simple question. Is the actual income gap, measured in dollars, between the rich and poor getting smaller, or is it getting bigger?
Let's use a really simple analogy to make this crystal clear. Picture two runners. Runner A has $10, runner B has $100. From a relative point of view, runner B is 10 times richer. Simple enough. Now, let's say they both have a great day and they double their money. A now has $20, B has $200. Well, relatively speaking, nothing has changed. B is still 10 times richer. But, and this is the key part, if you look at it from an absolute view, the dollar gap between them just went from $90 to $180. It literally doubled. It's the same event, but you get two totally different outcomes.
So how do these two different ways of measuring play out in the real world? Well, they tell completely different stories. First, let's look through that more optimistic lens, the relative one.
So, looking through this relative lens, the story is one of dramatic convergence, especially recently, after decades of things being pretty stable or even ambiguous. That includes the famous elephant curve period where the poorest and the super rich saw big gains, but the middle classes in developed countries kind of stagnated. After all that, something big shifted right around the year 2000. For the last 2 decades, relative inequality has been in a clear, steady decline, and all the projections show that trend is expected to keep going.
So what caused this incredible turnaround? Well, the main driver by far has been the explosive economic growth of emerging economies. Just as researcher Carlos Gradín puts it, the unbelievable development in countries like China and India has lifted hundreds of millions of people, allowing them to finally start catching up to the developed world, at least in terms of growth rates.
So here's the bottom line. If you only look at relative inequality, the conclusion is pretty clear, and it's optimistic. The world is converging. It's becoming a more equal place. It's a great story. But that's only half the story.
Because if we swap our glasses and we start looking at that absolute dollar gap, a much more sobering and, frankly, a much more concerning picture starts to emerge.
I mean, the research on this is just crystal clear. While countries were getting closer in percentage terms, the raw dollar gap between the world's richest and poorest citizens has been widening, almost nonstop for over 70 years.
And here's the tricky math behind why that happens. A 10% raise on a $1,000 income is $100. That's fantastic growth. But a much smaller 2% raise on a $1 million income is $20,000. So even when the poor person's income is growing 5 times faster in relative terms, the absolute dollar gap between them just grew by $19,900. It's wild. In fact, the only times this trend has even paused were during massive global recessions.
So here we are with two totally true but conflicting stories. We have a world that is relatively converging, but at the same time, it's absolutely diverging. And this leads us to the most crucial point, which is where the story of inequality is heading next.
because the very nature of the problem is changing right before our eyes.
You see, in the past, the single biggest factor that determined your wealth was which country you happened to be born in. The main story was the gap between rich nations and poor nations. But that is shifting, and it's shifting fast. Today, inequality is increasingly a story of what's happening within the borders of a single country, that gap between the richest and poorest citizens of the exact same nation.
I mean, think about it this way. If you go back to 1980, the vast majority of global inequality, we're talking about 3/4 of it, was explained by the gap between countries. Where you lived was pretty much everything.
Now fast forward to today, and you can see that picture has dramatically changed. The between-country part has shrunk, while that within-country piece has grown and grown, and now it makes up a much larger, much more critical part of the global inequality puzzle. Your citizenship still matters, of course, but the gap between you and your richest compatriot is becoming just as important.
So we end up right back where we began, with this huge paradox. We live in a world that is, by one very real measure, more equal than it has been in decades. And at the exact same time, we live in a world where the dollar chasm between the rich and the poor is wider than it has ever been. And it leaves us with a final question to really think about. Which of these two truths matters more?